Before you hear this story, I need you to understand something about trust. Not the kind you build over years with a stranger. The kind you give away freely, without even realizing it, because the person asking for it already has your last name. My name is Clifford. I'm 63 years old, retired from 26 years with the City of Memphis Public Works Department, and I found out my son-in-law was trying to have me declared mentally incompetent on the same Thursday afternoon I was supposed to be at my granddaughter's school play. I missed the play. I sat instead in a conference room at First Tennessee Bank on Union Avenue, watching a woman named Patricia Odom from the Fraud Prevention Unit slide a printed email across the table toward a man who could barely look me in the eye. The man who used to call me Pop. To understand how I got there, I need to take you back 6 weeks. To Christmas morning. To a gift I should have looked at more carefully. I live in the same house I'd bought with my late wife Gloria in 1989. 3 bedrooms, a carport, a backyard that floods every spring no matter what the city tells me about the drainage improvements they made in 2018. Gloria passed 8 years ago. Breast cancer. I still keep her reading glasses on the nightstand, which my daughter Renata says is not healthy, and which I say is none of her business. Renata is my only child. She's 37, teaches middle school science over in Bartlett, and has been married to a man named Dwayne for 11 years. Dwayne sells commercial real estate. He's good at it. He drives a truck that costs more than my first house, which he reminds me of every time he pulls into my carport. We've never been enemies. I want to be clear about that. Dwayne and I have always been what I'd call politely distant. He comes to Sunday dinners. He helps me carry things when I ask. He laughs at my jokes even when they're not funny, which I used to take as courtesy and now understand was something else entirely. Christmas morning, Renata and Dwayne came over early. My granddaughter Zoe, who is 9 and obsessed with everything that makes noise, tore through her presents in under 4 minutes. When the wrapping paper settled, Dwayne handed me a flat box with a bow on it. "From both of us," Renata said. "We thought it might help you around the house." Inside was a smart home device. One of those small cylindrical speakers that sits on your counter and listens for your voice. The brand wasn't one I recognized. The box looked almost right, like a knockoff that had gotten close but not quite. I thanked them, set it on the kitchen counter next to the coffee maker, and didn't think about it again for 3 weeks. That was my first mistake. My neighbor across the street is a man named Otis Fry. We've known each other since before our kids were in grade school. He worked for FedEx for 30 years, spent his last 8 in their tech security division, and retired the same year I did. Otis is the kind of man who notices things, not in a paranoid way, in the way of someone who spent decades thinking about how packages get lost and who's responsible when they do. In January, Otis came over to watch a Memphis Grizzlies game. He walked through the kitchen to get to the living room, stopped, and looked at the counter. "When did you get that?" he asked. "Christmas." From Renata and Dwayne. He didn't say anything for a moment. Picked it up. Turned it over. Looked at the bottom. "Cliff," he said, "this isn't a retail unit." I told him I didn't know what that meant. He set it down carefully, the way you set down something you don't want to startle. The serial number on the bottom has been partially sanded off, and this port here, he pointed to a small input on the back I'd assumed was for a power adapter. This isn't standard. This has been opened and modified. I remember the kitchen felt very cold suddenly, even though the heat was running. "Modified how?" I asked. Otis looked at me. "I'd need to check. But I think this thing's been set up to do more than play music and tell you the weather." We didn't watch the game that night. Otis took the device home and spent 2 days on it. On the 3rd day, he came back with a yellow legal pad filled with notes written in his tight, careful handwriting. "It's connected to a third-party server," he said. "Not the manufacturer's, someone else's. Whoever set it up can access whatever audio it captures. And because you've been using the wake word to turn your lights on and adjust the thermostat, it's been active a lot. My mouth went dry. How long? I asked. Since you plugged it in? 3 weeks. 3 weeks of conversations in my own kitchen, calls with my insurance agent about the life policy I'd been reviewing. A long Sunday afternoon on the phone with my attorney, Vincent Carr, about updating my will. The evening I sat at the table and talked myself through whether I should finally sell the house and move somewhere smaller, and what that would mean for what I left behind for Renata. All of it in the open. In my own home. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't call Renata. What I did was sit down at my kitchen table for a long time in the silence that follows something like that. The kind of silence that isn't peaceful, that's just the absence of everything you thought you understood. Then I called Vincent. Vincent Carr has been my attorney for 19 years. He handled Gloria's estate. He's a quiet man who speaks slowly and charges by the hour, and I have never once begrudged him a single minute. When I told him what Otis had found, he didn't react the way I expected. He didn't express outrage. He got very still, the way he does when something is serious. "Has anything come through the mail recently?" he asked. "Anything from the bank or from a medical office that you didn't initiate?" I thought about it. There had been something a week or two before, an envelope from the bank asking me to confirm some account information for an upcoming review. I'd assumed it was routine. I hadn't opened it yet. I found it under a stack of Zoe's drawings on the dining room table. Inside was a notice about scheduling an appointment to discuss my financial planning options, particularly regarding my home equity and retirement accounts. It was addressed to me, but the contact name listed for follow-up was not mine. It was Dwayne's. I sat there holding that letter for a long time. Vincent told me not to call the bank yet, not to say anything to Renata or Dwayne. He said he needed 48 hours. I said I could manage 48 hours. That was the second hardest thing I've ever done in my life. The hardest came later. I kept the device on the counter. That was Vincent's suggestion, and Otis agreed, and I hated them both for being right. If I moved it or turned it off, whoever was on the other end would know something had changed. So I left it there, and I started talking. Not lies, exactly. Chosen truths. I stood at that counter in the mornings and talked to the walls about how I'd been feeling foggy lately, how I sometimes couldn't remember if I'd taken my blood pressure medication, how I was thinking I might need help managing things. I said it all in the casual, drifting way of a man who doesn't realize he's being listened to. Each word tasted like chalk. I'd worked in public works for 26 years. I managed crews of 40 men. I budgeted multi-million-dollar infrastructure projects. I never once lost track of a medication or a payment or a commitment in my life. But I stood in my own kitchen and performed confusion like it was a second job. The responses came quickly. Within 2 days, Renata called to check in. She asked how I was sleeping. She asked if I'd been keeping up with my doctor appointments. She asked very gently whether I'd thought about who would help me if I ever needed it. I said I hadn't thought much about it. She said Dwayne had some ideas. She said he'd been doing research. I said that was thoughtful of him. Then I went and sat in my car in the carport for 45 minutes. Vincent came back to me on a Friday with what he'd found. He'd made some calls. A woman named Sheila at the bank's Elder Financial Protection Unit knew the file already, it turned out, because someone had already contacted them twice. Dwayne had called once, asking about the process for a family member to assume financial management responsibility for an aging relative. He'd called a second time to ask whether a cognitive assessment from a private physician would be sufficient documentation for initiating such a process. My cognitive assessment that he was planning to arrange, without my knowledge. There's also this, Vincent said. He passed me a piece of paper. It was a screenshot of an email obtained through channels he didn't explain to me and that I didn't ask about. It was from Dwayne to someone named Kay Harwell, who Vincent identified as a document preparation service in Nashville. The email read, "Getting close. Need the POA templates and the capacity eval form. Once the doctor visit is set up, it moves fast. He won't fight it. He's not that kind of man. He's not that kind of man." I read that line 4 times. I read it until I understood that he wasn't wrong about who I'd been, and that he'd made the mistake of thinking that was who I still was. I want to tell you about the 2 weeks between finding that email and the meeting at the bank. Because people always want to know about the ending, and I understand that, but the middle is where a man finds out who he is. I went to my doctor first, on my own, without telling anyone. I sat in Dr. Pearson's office and asked him to document, in writing, that I was cognitively sharp, that my blood pressure was controlled, that my memory was excellent, and that I was, in his professional assessment, fully capable of managing my own affairs. He looked at me a little sideways, but he wrote it. He knew me. He'd been my doctor for 14 years. I updated my will with Vincent. I changed the beneficiary designations on my life insurance and my retirement accounts. I added a durable power of attorney naming Otis as my agent, not Renata, not Dwayne. I moved the accounts Dwayne didn't know about to a different bank entirely. I wrote everything down by hand in a spiral notebook that I kept at Otis's house. At Otis's suggestion, I also started saving every text message, every voicemail, every email. Otis showed me how to screenshot things properly, so the timestamps showed. He reminded me that in Tennessee, one-party consent means I could record my own phone calls, which I did twice when Dwayne called to casually ask about my health and my plans for the property going forward. He never said anything incriminating directly. He was careful, but careful over time still makes a pattern, and a pattern is a kind of proof. I didn't sleep much during those 2 weeks, not from fear, from anger mostly. The kind of anger that sits in your chest like a stone and won't move. I'd lie awake thinking about Zoe, about the fact that her father was doing this, about what it meant that Renata was either part of it or blind to it, and that I wasn't sure which was worse. One night, I drove past their house. I don't know why. I just sat outside for a few minutes in the dark with the engine running. The lights were on upstairs. I could see the blue flicker of the television. Everything looked ordinary. I drove home. Vincent arranged the meeting. He called it a routine financial review and let the bank invite the interested parties, meaning Dwayne, who brought Renata, who brought a folder she seemed uncomfortable holding. I arrived first. I sat across from an empty chair and drank bad coffee and thought about Gloria, about what she would say. She was a practical woman. She would have said to keep my face still and let the room do the work. So that's what I did. Dwayne came in wearing a blazer. He shook my hand. That took something from him, I could tell, but he managed it. Renata came in behind him and sat down without looking at me for the first 3 seconds, which was long enough to tell me everything. Sheila from the Fraud Protection Unit introduced herself. Vincent sat beside me, a man from the local police department's Financial Crimes Unit. Detective Mallory sat off to the side with a notepad he hadn't opened yet. Sheila started simply. She asked Dwayne whether he had contacted the bank on my behalf. He said he'd been trying to help. She asked whether I'd authorized him to do that. He paused. Said we'd discussed it as a family. She looked at me. I shook my head once. She nodded and slid a printout to the center of the table. It was a log of his calls. Dates, times, the nature of each inquiry. She asked him to confirm whether the calls were his. He confirmed them. She then placed a second document next to the first. A copy of the device Otis had examined, with Otis's written findings attached. And then a third document, the email to Kay Harwell in Nashville. Dwayne's jaw tightened. He looked at me for the first time. Really looked. "This is being taken out of context," he said. Detective Mallory opened his notepad. Renata said very quietly, "Dwayne, what is this?" He started to answer her. He said he was trying to protect the family. He said I was getting older and that the house was a significant asset and that someone needed to be thinking ahead. He said I wasn't being realistic about my situation. He said it fast, the way people talk when they're trying to outrun something. Renata let him finish. Then she said, "Did you bug my father's house?" The room got very quiet. He said it wasn't like that. He said the device was just a way to stay informed. I set my coffee down. "Informed about what, Dwayne?" I said. "I'm a 63-year-old man in good health with a paid-off house and a clear mind. What exactly were you staying informed about?" He didn't have an answer. "Not a real one." Sheila informed him that any further contact with my accounts or financial institutions on his behalf would be treated as fraud. Detective Mallory informed him that the district attorney's office would be reviewing the materials for potential criminal charges related to elder financial exploitation under Tennessee law, which carries real consequences. He was not arrested that day, but he left the building with a different future than the one he'd walked in expecting. Renata cried in the parking lot. Not dramatically, just standing next to her car with her arms crossed and tears running down her face like she didn't have the energy to do anything about them. I stood a few feet away. I didn't go to her right away. I needed a moment. When I did walk over, she said, "I didn't know about the device, Dad. I need you to believe that." I looked at her for a long time. My daughter. 9 pounds 4 ounces, born during a thunderstorm. I told her to ride a bike in this same city, in a parking lot not far from here. "I believe you didn't know about the device," I said, "but you knew something was happening, and you let it." She didn't argue. That told me what I needed to know. I told her I loved her. I told her I needed time. I told her that whatever came next between us, it was going to start with honesty and take as long as it took. Then I drove home. The house was the same when I walked in. Same carpet, same smell of old wood and the cedar blocks Gloria used to keep in the closets. Same ticking clock above the stove. But I walked to the kitchen counter and I unplugged that device and I put it in a box in the garage, and the room felt different after that. Cleaner somehow. I called Otis. I told him it was done. He said, "Good. Come watch the Grizzlies tomorrow. I'll make chili." That was enough. The weeks that followed were quiet in the way that recovery is quiet. Not peaceful, not easy, just deliberate. I worked with Vincent to make sure everything was in order. I put a proper security system in the house, one with cameras I chose and controlled. I changed every password on every account. I shredded a drawer full of old documents I'd been meaning to sort through for years. Dwayne and Renata separated 2 months later. That's their story to tell, not mine. I only know that Renata showed up at my door on a Sunday evening in March with a pot of red beans and rice and sat at my kitchen table for 3 hours. We didn't talk about Dwayne much. We talked about Gloria, about Zoe, about what we wanted the next 10 years to look like. She cried once, near the end, and said she was sorry. I handed her a dish towel. "Eat," I said. "The beans are getting cold. The investigation is still ongoing. That's all Detective Mallory has told me, and that's all I'm going to say about it here. What I will tell you is that elder financial exploitation is the fastest growing form of financial crime in the country, and most of the people it happens to never see it coming, because it doesn't come from strangers. It comes from people who know your routines, who know what you have, who have decided that your age means your time is running out, so theirs might as well begin. I was 63 years old. I was sharp. I was healthy. And it almost worked anyway. Not because I was weak, because I trusted. Because a gift is a gift until you look at it more carefully, and most of us are raised not to look too carefully at gifts. So here's what I'll leave you with. If a device shows up in your home that you didn't buy yourself, look at it, turn it over, ask questions, check the model number against what's sold in stores. If something feels off, call someone you trust who knows more than you do about how these things work. Document everything. Write it down in ink. Keep copies somewhere outside your home. Your home is your life. Your name is your life. Your mind is your life. Don't hand any of it over because someone you love asked you to. And don't wait until you're sitting in a bank conference room to find out what they were really asking. I still keep Gloria's reading glasses on the nightstand. Renata still thinks that isn't healthy. She's probably right. But some things you keep because they remind you who you are. And knowing who you are is the only thing that kept me from losing everything.